Lawyers, what's the dumbest thing a client did to sabotage their own case? Not a lawyer, but when I went to live with my dad, we went to court to say I was now living with him and ceased child support to my mom. When my mother got the notice in the mail, she flipped the heck out saying she needed the money and how terrible me and my dad were being to her. Because we were states apart, she was able to appear in court through conference calls. Knowing how her mind works, I think she thought if she didn't answer the phone, then my dad would have to keep paying her, because logic. When the call went to voicemail, me and my dad exchanged a glance and the judge was mad. He's dealt with my mom before on child support matters and she already made a negative impression. He noted that she had failed to appear in court and cease support payments then and there, and then my dad and I celebrated with frittatas. Yeah, she thought ignoring the phone would magically make the legal obligation disappear, no? It's like thinking, if you close your eyes hard and tight enough, this speeding ticket won't exist. Story 2. Was involved in a custody case where the ex-wife was attempting to frame the father for mistreatment of the children. One of the social services people was getting suspicious, made a surprise visit to ex-wife's house relatively late at night, 12 or so hours before the father was supposed to get the kid. Fresh bruises on the kid's back and thighs must have been done in the last 24 hours. Story 3. Not my client, but a case I've seen. A couple is separating. They've got a house together and 3 kids. Both lawyers have worked hard to try to get an agreement about who will have the house, where the kids will live, etc. Making progress. Bad move number 1. During a discussion between wife and husband about dividing the assets and a payout for the house, the wife attempts to terminate the husband. After getting out of the hospital, the husband, recovering from wounds, remains in the house with the children. Wife gets out on bail, is required to stay away from husband and house. Wife doesn't want children living with husband and thinks he is a danger to them. Bad move number 2. Wife calls power company, asks them to shut off to home. Husband finds out when the power company leaves a hanger on the door notifying that power will be shut off in 2 days and to call the power company if they want to change this. Nothing says, I'm looking out for my children's best interests, quite like having their power disconnected. Story 4. Admitted to the crime he was accused of over the jail phone, which, for those of you who don't know, is recorded. He had been maintaining his innocence up until that point, and there was a good chance he'd be acquitted since the prosecutor didn't have much of a case until he ran his mouth. We were ready to go to trial and everything. What makes it even dumber is that he'd been to jail numerous times beforehand and knew his calls were recorded. The jail phone even tells you the calls are recorded before you make the call. Had to plead him out to 10 years since he was facing 25 to life. Story 5. I have a schmuck younger brother. He's been to jail I don't know how many times and then did 5 years in prison. My mother and stepfather dragged my baby sister every weekend to the many different prisons that he went to across the state. He kept getting moved because of gambling with money he didn't have and fights. They go one time and the officers separate my mother and my then 17-year-old honor student sister. The female guards search my sister in front of them all, the while refusing to allow my mother in the room or my sister to leave. There was nothing. She had nothing. My mother didn't want to file any charges against the guards or even look into it because she felt they might do something to my idiot brother. I felt that they should have either allowed her to leave or if she wanted to proceed despite the search, she would have in the least had my mother present. My mother and brother claimed to have no idea why it had happened and that it was probably just a guard picking on her. It turned out, though, when I talked to my sister that my idiot brother had called the house when she was the only one home. He had demanded that she smuggle him in money and cigarettes. She refused, and he began screaming at her over the phone. She just wanted to end the conversation, so she basically said she would do whatever he wanted. She didn't, of course, but that is why she was searched because the moron called her on a jail phone and tried to force her to bring him in contraband. I still feel the guards were in the wrong to search her without a parent present, but he instigated it by being a schmuck. Story 6. This doesn't quite fit with your question because if they chose not to have or fire their lawyer, don't self-represent, there is a reason why the right to be represented is so important. I recently saw someone, not my client, the opposition, attempt to convince a judge that they weren't suffering from paranoid delusions by showing the judge photographic evidence that a microchip had been implanted in their body. Had they accepted legal representation, they would have been strongly advised against that approach. Story 7. Not a lawyer, etc. I was in the midst of a messy court case with the person who I conceived my daughter with. He chose to speak via phone link rather than appear in person a few times. One of the times, he was either not in a fit mental state to understand that he was on speaker, or was just not bright enough to understand what was explained to him. He was supposed to be answering a question about why he hadn't complied with court orders, but instead, he went off on a hateful diatribe about me, which included a tangent about his substance use and calling me inappropriate words. It was pretty awkward for all involved, but it helped prove my case. Story 8. I had a client in jail awaiting trial on charges. About a month before trial, this person sends a letter through intermediaries to the victim, threatening both the victim as well as anyone that helps the victim. This was after the client had been instructed numerous times that, other than me, there was not to be communication in any way with anyone about the case. The prison listens on all calls to inmates and reads all outgoing mail. Needless to say, the letters were intercepted and new charges of witness intimidation were filed. Prior to this, the client had a pretty decent case. Several months later, the client did the same thing over again. There was no privileged information contained in this post. All facts listed above were contained in the public record in the form of charges and affidavits of probable cause. Story 9. Not a lawyer, but my mom was in a pretty bad car accident like 5 years ago in which the driver of the other car ran a red light and T-boned my mom's car. Totaled. She was expected to get a decent settlement given her injuries and psychological complications, but between the time of the accident and her deposition, she was involved in a fender bender in which the driver in the car behind her at a red light fully stopped, turned around to quiet his screaming kid, accidentally released the brake pedal and rolled into my mom's car, barely nudged it. My mom, apparently not having her hunger for attention satiated by everyone else close to her, let it slip at the deposition that she was the victim of 2 car accidents. They basically discredited her defense with a "how do we know all your pain wasn't caused by the second accident" counter-argument. 5 years and multiple hearings later, she still hasn't seen a dime and is still convinced that she will. I personally think she screwed herself out of a settlement. Story 10. I was working on a child welfare case where the father was ordered to undergo hair follicle testing for substance abuse. Then he shaved off all of his hair, head, facial, and body, but insisted to the social workers and even the judge that it was just something he'd been planning to do all along and it had nothing to do with testing. The father wasn't my client, but I was representing the mother, who was still in a relationship with him. In the end, they consented to a grandparent getting custody of the child. Story 11. Lawyer friend told me a story about a man who had just gone through a years-long divorce settlement. The guy had money, and the ex had a good lawyer. My friend had somehow gotten it down to around an even split, and they were about to settle. The guy then stops the whole thing and wants to go back to square one because the men's rights group that he's a member of told him he should fight for a better deal. The idiot lost everything. If you're paying someone for legal advice, take it. Story 12. Probably everything that my mom did during my parents' divorce. I was staying with my dad because my mom had been mentally and physically cruel towards me, which was the main cause for their divorce. Her and her best friend made a fake call to CPS and claimed that my dad was mistreating me. That went over well. After she started pretending to be nice and I started driving, I started visiting her once in a while. One day she stole my keys, purse, and phone, beat me, and said that I was never going to get out of her house. So I ran a mile through the woods and made it to a church where I used their phone to call my dad. When he knocked on her door to get my belongings, she attacked him. She was arrested for mistreatment. When my dad got a girlfriend, my mom found out where she lived and sat in her driveway for over an hour with her 2 friends in the car trying to get them to come outside and repeatedly honking the horn. Cops were called again. My dad ended up pretty much giving her whatever she wanted so the BS would stop. It was really wearing on my little brother and I because she constantly tried to use us as tools against him. She got the house and a lot of money from him, but didn't give a crap as long as he didn't have to see her anymore. Story 13. Not a lawyer, but a family member was once present at a court appointment where it was decided whether this really awful woman would regain custody of her daughter. Cruel mom decided to represent herself, which turned out even worse than you might expect. She spent the entire time exasperating the judge by harping on irrelevant topics, repeatedly trying to testify in her questions while she was cross-examining people, arguing that her cruel behavior was justified because her daughter had it coming, etc. But the best part was when one of the witnesses testified that cruel mom had struck the daughter with the wooden spoon. Cruel mom responds, "I did not hit her. I missed it. You can come to my house and I'll show you the dent I left in the door jamb." She didn't get custody. Story 14. And there's a lot of examples. Openly talking about substance sales on their home phone after they had already been arrested by the FBI for substance. These geniuses lived in a mobile home out in the middle of nowhere. The cops installed a pole next to their house and put a camera on it, aimed it right at the house. They did not stop using the goddamn phone or dealing out of their house. Total idiots. Being incredibly sloppy on their cell phones. Do not talk about substances. Do not text about substances. Do not think your code words will work. Nobody ever paid $180 an ounce for green beans. Real life example. Reacting to getting arrested by treating the cops like they are your parents. No, coming clean won't shave a week off your grounding, so maybe you can go to prom. It's going to ensure a conviction and make sure you have no leverage at all. Believing that the reason I'm telling them to take the plea deal is not that they have taken every conceivable step to screw themselves, it's because I'm stupid. If they had a real attorney, he'd pull some law and order shenanigans and get you off in spite of the fact you did it on video, you confessed to it, and your friends are ratting you out. No, you screwed yourself. Own up to it and do what you can to mitigate the damage. You ain't getting probation on a 10-year mandatory minimum. If you listen to me, I can get you 3 years instead of 12, but you need to do what I say. Treating cops like parents is a pretty bold strategy. Let's see if it would pay off. Spoiler alert, it won't. Story 15. Not a lawyer, but over the summer, I interned at a forensic accounting firm in the litigation department where I would sit in on arbitrations a lot. One time during a dispute between a very famous author and an accounting firm she contracted to investigate some of her missing assets. Well, until her deposition, she was winning the case and it was substantially leaning in her favor. And then she talked. She was crazy, couldn't give a straight answer to anything to the point where the opposing lawyer specifically asked the arbitrator if allowed, and then asked the author if she could just please answer in yes or no answers. This would normally not be allowed as it limits her responses, but she wouldn't answer questions and go on forever telling her story of what she thought was going on that the arbitrator allowed it. She had a story she wanted to tell and used every question to try and tell it no matter how unrelated it was. It went a little like this. Lawyer: Miss Crazy, did you read the contract agreement and sign it in your contracting of the accounting firm? Miss Crazy: Well, you see, I've worked really hard and I've gotten a lot of money in investments and I was looking into these accounts and I noticed money is missing and when I looked into it, I found blah, 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 blah. Completely hurt herself in the foot. Instead of winning all the money demanded and requested, she lost completely and even had to pay from a counter lawsuit. Story 16. We'll probably get buried by now, but gotta share anyway. In a personal injury case, a claimant was going for permanent total disability because he injured his back on the job and was apparently unable to walk without assistance or use any of his limbs without any amount of power or dexterity. If the guy won the PTD, he'd get tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars from his employer over the rest of his life. A week before the trial, my dad, who was representing his employer, got a vague tip from one of the guy's coworkers. Apparently, the claimant was not well liked to watch Jeopardy tonight. So that night, he tuned in and lo and behold, the claimant is a contestant. And he's winning. So this guy, who claims to be permanently disabled, is jumping around in celebration and waving his arms around on national television. My dad, never one to pass up a zinger opportunity, called the attorney representing the claimant the next day and told him they'd settle the case out of court for $50, or he could ask his client if he wanted to spin the wheel. Opposing counsel was pretty indignant until he repeated this offer to his client. They took the $50 settlement. Story 17. My parents got divorced about 10 years ago. Before that, they both ran a successful company, but my mom did all the work while my dad just played the CEO role and spent the cash. My dad ended up getting caught sleeping with multiple men and women during the marriage. To avoid responsibility for his actions, he claimed insanity and even hurt himself. He knew how to do this without actually causing serious harm. During the divorce, he claimed to be responsible for over half of the company's revenue. The judge sided with my mom because he wouldn't allow my dad to claim insanity and be a successful CEO at the same time. Story 18. Not a lawyer, but I have a friend whose dad was helping jump a stranger's car on the side of the road, and a college girl was texting and driving and hit and ended him. They took away her driving privileges and her license, the like. Well, she came into court and set her car keys down in front of her. She was asked about it, and she said, "My friend drove me." They then asked her why she had the keys, and she said, "Well, my friend drove me in my car, so she gave me my keys back because why would I let her keep my keys?" Let's just say it didn't end in her favor when it was pointed out that her friend was not present and would have no way home without those keys. Story 19. When I was a law student, I worked in a criminal defense clinic. We got assigned clients who were in deep freaking crap and couldn't afford lawyers. Now, this guy was in deep crap. The FBI had wiretapped him and videotaped him talking about termination and running substances. We convinced him to cooperate with the government to go after the bigger fish. He made a statement to the government admitting to terminations, admitting to trafficking, and admitting to the racketeering activities. If he agreed to testify against the higher-ups, he would have gotten out in like 20 years. Not bad for a dude that ended people. The gang members must have gotten to him because he suddenly decided he would stop cooperating with the government and wanted a trial. He was tried and convicted along with all of his gang members that he ratted out. Life in prison with no possibility of parole. What a freaking idiot. Story 20. Not a lawyer, but was involved in a custody case where the father was attempting to get custody from his baby mama. Mother appeared at a hearing a week prior to the final hearing where custody was to be decided. Mother testified that she had a job. She didn't. Her car was in the shop. We knew it had been repoed and was moving into a new home, had previously been living on a friend's couch with the child. We spent the next week getting affidavits that the car was repoed and the owner's home she was attempting to rent had never heard of her and that she wasn't likely to be getting the job she claimed to as it required special licensing that she didn't have. Mother then did not show up for the final hearing, so the father won full custody and everything he'd asked for. Limited visitation for mother and no geographic restrictions on his residence. Then, as icing on the cake, the judge ruled that since the mother had testified to having a job, she'd now be paying the father child support, extremely rare in my state. Story 21. One of the attorneys and doctors at lectures at our school told us that people in pain generally look like it. They don't put on makeup, get really dressed up, etc. Stories. He was representing one woman who was in an auto accident suing for pain and back injuries, and he told her to dress casual to the deposition and not to wear the 6-inch heels she normally wears. She showed up to the deposition in the heels and her case got thrown out because how can you wear such high heels when you are claiming your back hurts? An expert witness who was a doctor was testifying in a deposition that the plaintiff sustained knee injuries. My doctor/lawyer teacher was part of the defense and straight up asked the other doctor, "Sir, I see on your wall that you graduated from Johns Hopkins in 1968. Doctor, yes. Attorney, so you haven't done an orthopedic residence since 1967 or worked in that field since then? Doctor, no. Attorney, so you aren't qualified to be an expert in orthopedics? Doctor, no. Case dismissed. One attorney was questioning a witness and straight up asked them in court, "Miss, isn't it true that you were nervous to testify today because you have lied throughout this whole case?" Witness, yes. Another doctor in a medical malpractice case removed a non-cancerous part from a child, knew beforehand it was not malignant, and testified on the record that he would have removed it even if the parents had not given their permission. Jury found for the parents. Story 22. I am a personal injury attorney. One time I had a lady who needed back surgery after her wreck. All the doctors said she didn't need it before an 18-wheeler wrecked into her, but that she needed it after. It was a multi-level cervical discectomy, removing the soft tissues from between the vertebrae in the back of her neck, and it was going to leave her unable to work for the rest of her life due to all her restrictions. My client repeatedly swore that she had never ever had a neck problem prior to the car wreck. The defense lawyer had found records from about 12 years prior where she had been treating with a doctor due to neck pain for about 2 years and sprung them on her at trial. My client's reaction was, "That's a lie, that's not me," even though the records had her name, birth date, and social security number. The jury came back and gave her $0 despite the fact that the wreck was the fault of an 18-wheeler driver. When I talked to the jury after the case, they said, "We just couldn't allow money in our verdict for someone who would lie under oath like that." If my client had simply told me that she had prior treatment on her neck so long before, it would not have been a big deal. All the doctors agreed that she needed the surgery because of the wreck. That case would have been worth more than $1 million in future medical care and future lost earnings. Story 23. Late to the party, but this craziness happened when I was in law school observing court cases. A man client is attempting to sue his attorney for the return of the attorney's fees, alleging that he was not a good attorney. Necessary backstory: said attorney had gotten the client off for misconduct, big case, on a technicality. Basically a huge win for the client. Client is upset and doesn't want to pay because the attorney didn't put the client on the stand to defend himself. 1, the client didn't need to due to the technicality the attorney found. And 2, the attorney knew the client would perjure himself because of things the client said to the attorney beforehand. Now back to the case, client keeps asking attorney who was on the stand why he wouldn't let him testify in the previous case. An attorney keeps saying that he cannot answer that question because of attorney-client privilege, and answering that could put his entire career in jeopardy. After about 20 of these repeated questions, the judge asks the client if he wants to waive this privilege so the attorney can answer his question and informs the client of the risks involved. Client says yes, and the attorney proceeds to spill the entire backstory I just told you, along with the gruesome details. It was some horrible crap. Result, the judge awards full attorney's fees to the attorney. And now that this information is on the public record, the DA can use the testimony against the client for other charges not previously charged, avoiding double jeopardy but can bust him for the crimes nonetheless. I felt bad for the attorney as he was a great guy in a crappy situation. Got to speak to him afterward about what he thought about the whole deal. Essentially, it was his greatest mistake and biggest regret of his life, but he believed in the process of a fair trial. I never did find out whether the client was charged, but I still hope it happened and he got what he deserved. Story 24. Not a lawyer, but my dad went to court to try and stop paying support because he ruined his relationship with me. His reasoning was, I want to stop paying support so that I can develop a relationship with my daughter. The judge just stared at him blankly and said, hold on, let me get this straight. I want you to realize what you're saying here. You want to stop paying support for your child because you think that will help your relationship with her? He said yes. She laughed at the case and said, get the heck out of here. Story 25. This defense lawyer I know of kept screwing up in court and flying by the seat of his pants and getting away with it until it finally caught up to him. The dude just seemed totally unprepared or distracted and would just not get things right. I kind of felt like he would rush through all his research and preparation just to get to the courtroom because he felt that's where the action was, and that's where he really shined. To be fair, he was a pretty smart guy. Sometimes he had a sixth sense for details that would seem to help him win cases. So he was fairly successful. And so he gets this case. I think it was a termination case. I don't know. He just knows nothing about it. I don't know if he just completely blew off preparing or got assigned the case last minute or was just intoxicated. But the minute he entered the courtroom, you could tell something was off. He was objecting to the most routine statements and presentations made by the prosecution. His basis for objections were overruled because he didn't know what the hell he was talking about. Finally, after a pretty weak attempt at a defense, the judge, sensing he was full of crap, started just bluntly asking him pointed questions about his defense to which he stumbled and really couldn't completely answer. And after about the fifth question, the judge seemed fed up and just moved to issuing his judgment as it was a bench trial and declared his client guilty. Now, I don't know if the guy was actually a criminal, but he had a poor defense. Story 26. Not a lawyer yet, but just this summer in Maryland, a guy decided to take his sure thing acquittal and toss it out the window. In this area of Maryland, stealing cars from gas stations is popular, and this exactly is what our criminal did. He stole some woman's car while she was pumping gas. Shortly thereafter, when police are talking to the woman at the gas station, the thief drives right by in the stolen car as she's describing it. So she just points at it and says, "That's actually it right there." The two officers on scene decide to chase him. The problem is their department's policies only allow chases in very limited circumstances. Generally, armed crimes are the only way to get to chase a suspect. Car theft is not one of the excuses to initiate a chase, so the officers are breaking their own self-imposed rules. Our thief leads this cruiser on a chase down the highway, zipping between cars until the cruiser swerves to avoid another car, flips, throws the driver from the vehicle, and ended him. The thief is eventually caught, but with evidence showing that the officers engaged in a case they weren't allowed to begin, the guy was set to get off because all he had done was steal a car and commit some reckless driving offenses that were only going to get him like 6 months, which he had basically served by the date of trial. But rather than get away with it, our thief decided to write a letter to his friend from jail, asking him to end a witness he thought might help convict him. I sat in the courtroom just face-palming as a prosecutor read from the letter. The thief went from time served to 15 years with a single sheet of paper. Story 27. Story from a family member who is a lawyer. He was defending a guy who was falsely accused of mistreating his maid. That was the charge. He supposedly hurt her in the study one day. During her testimony, it's not going well. She's contradicting herself and people aren't convinced. So then she says, and that's when he mistreated me. Turns out, if you suddenly change your story to something much more dramatic, something which would have had different criminal charges from the ones you've already made, it makes people suspect that maybe you're just making the whole thing up. My relative actually just stopped questioning her. He just let her step in it, and the case was basically over at that point. Story 28. This is late, but oh well. What angers me is people who, even when caught red-handed, deny till their last breath that they did it. I saw a guy in the news last year that I knew from years and years ago who had run over his roommate with a samurai sword. Naturally, I looked him up in the criminal court clerk database and found out from a separate affidavit he'd actually called the guy he hurt from jail and threatened him if he came to court. The guy hung up the phone and promptly called the DA. Even when playing the recording, he swore up and down that it wasn't him. Story 29. I interned with a public defender my last year of law school. My personal favorite was the guy charged with terminating his former, best friend. They never found the weapon, nor was there any other real physical evidence. The police did have one pretty good piece of evidence, though. The idiot confessed. He spent about 4 hours telling the cops everything, why he did it, how he did it, etc., and not with a lot of prodding on their part either. So not only is he charged with crime, he's being held without bail. Who does he blame? His legal representation. I can still remember my boss arguing with him. My boss had been a public defender a little too long and could barely restrain himself from talking to a lot of his clients. It went kind of like this. We'll call the defendant Robert. Every time we went to see him, he'd stare at us for not getting him out on bail. Robert, I just don't understand why you can't get me out of here. My boss, because you confessed to the crime, idiot. Robert, but they don't have any evidence against me. My boss, actually, that's not true. They have an eyewitness who told them everything about the crime, and now they have quite a bit that corroborates what he said. Robert, really? Who? My boss, you idiot. It's like he thinks confessing to a crime is just a minor clerical error that can be easily fixed with the right paperwork. Story 30. My law professor had a case where the plaintiff was relying upon data made by an expert for their entire case. Being the thorough man he is, he checked the math. The base number that the plaintiff was using had been calculated wrong, so he didn't say anything and waited to trial. At trial, he said, "So this first figure is right?" "Yes." "Are you sure?" "Yes." "Okay, check the math." Hands him a calculator and the expert's eyes get huge. He knows. And then my prof says, "Okay, how about the second figure?" "Same thing." "So would you say all of the figures are wrong?" "No." "Okay, how about the third figure?" "Same thing." Courtroom goes silent. Needless to say, he won the directed verdict. Story 31. I'm late to this game, but this one is kind of funny. When I was in law school, I worked with a solo practitioner. We were going to trial for our client on a charge of impersonating a police officer. Our client got intoxicated and called in to order a pizza from Pizza Ranch. After agreeing with them on how long it would take to make, he decided it would speed up his order if he told the worker he was a cop. Turns out the pizza worker was a reserve firefighter and knew all the cops. After being charged, the client tried to right the ship by writing an apology letter to the police department of all people. I also had a friend get food poisoning from the Pizza Ranch. Moral of the story, bad things happen at the Pizza Ranch. Story 32. I'm an attorney, although this is not my case, but one in the firm that happened in the last 6 months. Go through pre-trial on a medical malpractice case, no chance of settlement because both sides are playing hardball. The client had good damages and the expert was great. Client is put on the stand last in the order of proof. On cross-examination says, "I'm tired of not having money. The amount of money spent on medical malpractice cases is insane. The amount of time put into the cases was insane, and halfway through trial, the client drops that. And the jury dropped a defense verdict for a valid medical malpractice claim, and there is very little left for the appeals. Just why?" Story 33. Not my client, but the petitioner attorney's client. The man claimed workers' compensation and threw the kitchen sink at us, meaning he basically just listed over half of his body on the claim petition stating that he injured each one. He was full of crap, and my firm knew it. Anyways, we were going to trial, and the day before we ran one more social media search, this absolute freaking idiot posted a video of him winning a breakdance competition of all things. That was only a few months after the alleged work incident. Never saw a quicker dismissal in my life. Story 34. Not an attorney, but one client of ours baffles me to this day. He had multiple cases, including aggravated attack. At the insistence of the dude's family, we moved heaven and earth, getting him a bond so that he could get out of jail and live with said family until the case was over. The whole process took weeks. Less than a day after getting out, he was caught stealing $16 worth of batteries from Target. Bond revoked. To be fair, the line between stupidity and compulsion is blurred with this one. Story 35. Not a lawyer. Heard this story from a guy I used to work with. His brother-in-law got injured at work and was suing for a hefty sum. Case was pretty much open and shut. All the evidence was in the BIL's favor until the BIL started talking. They asked him to tell them about the day of the accident. BIL started out fine until he got to the place where he approached the piece of equipment that injured him. He told everyone there was a note on it stating that it was out of order. BIL then says that he discarded the note and started up the piece of malfunctioning equipment as he had a job to get done. That easy win was discarded faster than that out of order sign. Story 36. I was defending a client who was accused of trademark infringement. Thought he knew better than the IP attorney assigned to his case, me, and so went on his company's website to defend himself by basically confessing to what he did and claiming it wasn't against the law and the trademark owner was a woke baby who needed to either learn the law or get back in the kitchen and make her husband a sandwich. I wish I could say I was joking. I was one email away from negotiating a settlement that would have allowed the continued use of the complainant's mark with limited restrictions and a very nominal fee. Little to say, she saw his website, told us to go screw ourselves, and dragged it before a judge. My client lost, big. His lack of self-control cost him thousands of dollars. Story 37. Not an attorney, worked in a firm, workers' compensation claim, guy falls down at work and claims he injured many different body parts, shoulder, knees, back. We tell him to stay off social media. No problem, he doesn't use social media. At trial, he tells the judge he used to be a spin class instructor, but since the accident, he cannot teach classes anymore. Well, turns out he continued to teach these classes after his injury. This was proved by the hours of surveillance the insurance company did, showing him teaching and vigorously riding in spin class. How did the insurance company know he was still an active instructor? The guy posted his full teaching schedule on his FB page. His potentially very lucrative claim was quickly changed to a fraud claim against him. Story 38. I'm not a lawyer, but I used to review disability claims, so I often work with clients who had lawyers. A man whose attorney had instructed him to not speak with us directly, a very smart, very basic recommendation, called me up to rant, angrily, that his lawyer was wrong. He could shop for groceries and mow the lawn and do all sorts of housework just fine, thank you. Now, I have seen this man's medical records. There's no way he was doing all of this without difficulty. So I probed a little further. He could shop for groceries as long as he used a mobility scooter and had his wife carry things in the house. He could mow the lawn if he used a riding mower and took a lengthy break every 10 minutes or so. He could do housework, which was limited to wiping down counters and folding, but not carrying laundry. I called his attorney and gave them a quick update as soon as he and I hung up. I approved his claim, but that man is so damn lucky he got someone who was willing to take an extra 15 minutes with him. Story 39. I'm a criminal defense lawyer. Client arrested on DUI. Client lived in a small town. He and his wife would drive to the one bar in town, drink, then walk to their houseboat after a night at the bar, about a quarter-mile away. He and wife know everyone in the bar. Another patron they know gets blasted. The bar owner says she can't stay, and the client and wife walk her to his car to stay there until the ride comes. Client gets her in the backseat of the SUV. Client is intoxicated, drops keys on the way to front seat, opens now unlocked front door, turns on car lights to see he walked around the front from rear passenger. Cops are waiting to see if people leave bar intoxicated. Sees lights, says he saw him driving, immediately rolls up to arrest client. Client has prior DUI from 12-ish years before. Judge agreed that it wouldn't come in, the jury wouldn't hear it unless he opened the door. Can't win the case unless the dude testifies. I prep him, continue to prep him, keep prepping him, but tell him under no circumstances can he say he would never drive intoxicated, never do anything like that. Basically, anything about the past? No. Direct is going well. I give him a beautiful, easy last question where he could explain the night, explain why he was upset he got arrested because he wasn't driving and was doing everything right. I would never do something like that. Door open, judge lets DA in rebuttal bring in old DUI. Jury took about 25 minutes to convict. And that's about one of 100 stories. Life is never dull in the criminal defense world. Story 40. Not a lawyer. My dad's psychotic ex-girlfriend was trying to press bogus charges on my dad in general, trying to ruin his life and career. And his family, she attempted to make some things up about me too. Had to go through interviews, detectives' office talks, APS visits. My dad and I filed protective orders. A response to the POs, and I was afraid it would happen, was to vandalize a part of his property in a very gross and obscene way. She also went back to the detective to make another claim on me, saying I stole her non-prescribed medicine, so basically admitting she had illegal medicines. So she got a bit more than just protective orders against her. She had jail time now too. Good riddance. Story 41. Had a domestic mistreatment case. For months, we went to preparatory hearings and gathering evidence and got restraining orders. By the time the trial was finally happening on the same morning of the hearing, the person I represented let me know she had gone on holiday with the defendant for a couple of weeks and had a grand old time. At that point, the opposing counsel approached me and told me he had lots of evidence of both the parties having a great time together. This, of course, doesn't mean cruelty didn't happen in the past, but it really undermined our case, where we had little evidence other than some testimonials. At that point, I had to explain to her how even beyond strict legal rules, the judge would potentially change her mind once she saw the claimant was out partying with the defendant, for whom a restraining order was requested. We settled and avoided the trial. Story 42. I have two stories that come to mind. One, a colleague of mine was representing an artist many years ago that had allegedly set quite a large fire that burned some public land. Due to the cost of the damage, it was felony. During the state's case in chief, he began fiddling. Recess had to be called. Funnily enough, that helped him in the punishment phase, since there was clearly a mental component there, but still, big oof. And I don't know if what had been shown up to that point would have gotten him guilty. Second was one of mine, again, many years ago, had gotten a guy a pretty great deal on a serious theft charge. Prior to it being entered, he ended up picked up by the sheriff's office for violating conditions of bond. How did he violate? The sheriff alleged that he used the banking information of the sheriff's office to pass fake checks. This meant that in the new charge, the sheriff's office was the victim. Needless to say, the deal vanished. And if you learned a thing or two from this video, please remember to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. And if you like these stories, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video.